Marcus Chin adjusted his cracked helmet one last time as the alien tribunal's verdict echoed through the crystalline chamber. The words still burned in his mind like acid: exile from the Galactic Defense Corps for insubordination and conduct unbecoming an officer. 20 years of faithful service, reduced to nothing because he refused to abandon civilians during the Kepler station evacuation. The transport ship's engines hummed beneath his boots as it carried him toward the frontier worlds, those forgotten corners of space where exiled soldiers went to disappear. Marcus stared out the viewport at the swirling colors of hyperspace, his weathered hands clenched into fists. The tribunal had stripped him of his rank, his pension, and his honor, but they couldn't strip away what he'd learned in 2 decades of fighting humanity's enemies. Next stop, Drakmore 7, the pilot announced over the intercom. End of the line, soldier. Drakmore 7. Marcus had heard whispers about this place, a mining world on the edge of unexplored space, where desperate people scratched out livings from hostile soil. It was the kind of place where questions weren't asked and past stayed buried. Perfect for a disgraced Marine with nowhere else to go. The ship shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace, revealing a brown and gray planet orbiting a dying red star. Drakmore 7 looked exactly like Marcus expected: cold, harsh, and unforgiving. As the transport descended through the thin atmosphere, he caught glimpses of scattered settlements connected by dusty roads that wound between rocky hills and abandoned mining sites. The spaceport was nothing more than a cleared patch of ground surrounded by prefabricated buildings that had seen better decades. Marcus gathered his few possessions: a worn duffel bag containing his civilian clothes, a small cache of credits, and a plasma pistol he'd managed to keep hidden from the tribunal's confiscation officers, and stepped off the transport into the biting wind. The planet's twin moons hung low in the amber sky, casting strange shadows across the barren landscape. Marcus pulled his jacket tighter and made his way toward the settlement that sprawled beyond the spaceport. The buildings here were a mixture of dome-shaped structures and converted shipping containers, all connected by covered walkways that protected residents from the frequent dust storms. He found lodging at a rundown inn called the Rusty Comet, where the owner, a grizzled former spacer named Kowalski, asked no questions as long as the credits were good. The room was small and sparse, but it had a bed and a functioning environmental system. More importantly, it gave Marcus time to think about what came next. For 3 days, he wandered the settlement, observing its rhythms and routines. The people here were a hardy mix of miners, traders, and refugees from various conflicts across the galaxy. They worked hard, drank harder, and kept to themselves. It was the kind of place where a man could start over if he had the strength and determination to carve out a new life from nothing. On the 4th day, everything changed. Marcus was eating breakfast in the inn's common room when the ground began to shake. At first, he thought it might be mining equipment or a small earthquake, but the tremors were too rhythmic, too deliberate. Other patrons looked up nervously from their meals as dust rained from the ceiling. "What the hell is that?" someone muttered. Before anyone could answer, a young girl burst through the inn's front door, her eyes wide with terror. "Dragons!" she screamed. "The dragons are under attack!" The common room erupted in confused voices. Dragons? Marcus had heard the legends, of course, ancient beings that supposedly lived in the deep caves and rocky spires of frontier worlds like this one. But most people considered them myths, stories told to frighten children and impress tourists. "Where?" Kowalski demanded, grabbing the girl by her shoulders. "The Crimson Peaks," she gasped. "My brother was hunting near the old thermal vents when he saw them. Big ships, not from around here. They're bombing the nesting sites." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd seen enough orbital bombardments to recognize the pattern of those tremors. Someone was conducting a systematic attack, probably trying to clear the area for mining operations or research. But if there really were dragons in those peaks... He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "How far to the Crimson Peaks?" The girl looked at him with surprise. "About 20 kilometers north, but, mister, you can't." "I need transportation," Marcus interrupted, turning to Kowalski. The inn owner shook his head. "You're crazy if you think I'm lending you a speeder bike to go play hero. Those ships up there mean business, and whatever's happening in the peaks isn't our problem." Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out half of his remaining credits, slapping them on the table. "It's my problem now." Something in his voice, the authority that 20 years of command had burned into his vocal cords, made Kowalski step back. The older man studied Marcus for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Garage out back. Take the red bike, it's the fastest one I've got. But, don't expect me to come looking for your body. 15 minutes later, Marcus was racing across the barren landscape on a borrowed speeder bike, the crimson peaks growing larger on the horizon. The mountains got their name from the iron-rich rock that gave them a rust-colored appearance, but, as he drew closer, Marcus could see that the peaks were now shrouded in smoke and flame. The sound of weapons fire grew louder as he approached, punctuated by something else, a deep, resonant roaring that seemed to come from the mountains themselves. Marcus had heard many alien species vocalize over the years, but this was different. This sound carried pain, rage, and something that might have been desperation. He ditched the speeder bike behind a cluster of boulders and continued on foot, his military training taking over automatically. Moving from cover to cover, Marcus worked his way up the rocky slopes until he could get a clear view of what was happening. What he saw made his blood run cold. 3 sleek attack ships hovered above a series of cave openings high on the mountainside, their energy weapons carving glowing scars into the ancient rock. The ships bore no markings Marcus recognized, but their design was clearly military-grade, probably mercenaries hired by some corporation that wanted the dragons gone. And there were dragons. Marcus watched in amazement as massive, serpentine forms emerged from the damaged caves, their scales gleaming like polished metal in the firelight. They were beautiful and terrible at the same time, with wingspans that stretched nearly 50 meters and eyes that burned like stars. But they were also dying. The dragon's natural weapons, claws and fire breath, were useless against the ship's shields and altitude advantage. Marcus could see at least 3 massive bodies sprawled motionless on the rocky ledges, their lifeblood staining the crimson stone even deeper red. The surviving dragons were trying to defend what looked like a nursery cave, but they were being systematically cut down. One of the dragons, larger than the others and bearing scars from previous battles, positioned itself directly in front of the nursery entrance. Even as energy bolts tore through its wings and flanks, it refused to move. Its roar of defiance echoed across the peaks, a sound so full of noble rage that Marcus felt something break loose inside his chest. He'd spent 20 years fighting to protect the innocent, only to be discarded by superiors who cared more about politics than honor. But, here, on this forgotten world, he was watching the same scenario play out again, predators attacking those who couldn't defend themselves. Marcus pulled out his plasma pistol and checked the charge. It was a pathetic weapon compared to the firepower those ships possessed, but he'd learned long ago that sometimes courage mattered more than overwhelming force. Sometimes, the right person in the right place at the right time could change everything. The largest dragon stumbled as another energy bolt found its mark, golden blood streaming down its side. It looked up at its attackers with eyes full of ancient wisdom and unbending will, preparing for what was clearly going to be its final stand. Marcus made his decision. He sprinted up the rocky slope, his boots slipping on loose stones as he climbed toward the combat zone. The ship's attention was focused on the remaining dragons, giving him a window of opportunity. If he could reach one of the thermal vents he'd spotted earlier, he might be able to use the natural steam and mineral deposits to mask his approach. The climb took precious minutes he didn't have. Below him, Marcus could hear the dragon's roars growing weaker, more desperate. By the time he reached the thermal vent he'd been aiming for, the defending dragon was barely standing, its massive form swaying with exhaustion and blood loss. Marcus studied the attack ship's flight patterns, looking for weaknesses. They were maintaining a standard hovering formation, which suggested their pilots were competent but not exceptional. More importantly, they were using concentrated fire patterns that created brief windows where their shields had to cycle and reset. He waited for the next firing sequence, timing it carefully, then made his move. Sprinting across an exposed section of the slope, Marcus reached a position directly below one of the ships and aimed his plasma pistol at what he hoped was a critical system. The weapon discharged with a bright flash, its bolt striking the ship's underside. To his amazement, sparks erupted from the impact point and the vessel lurched to one side. Either he'd gotten incredibly lucky, or these mercenaries had made the mistake of using cheaper ships than their mission required. All 3 ships immediately turned toward his position, their weapons swiveling to target the new threat. Marcus had about 2 seconds before they turned him into vapor, but those 2 seconds were enough. The wounded dragon, the one that had been protecting the nursery, looked directly at him with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. In that brief moment, Marcus felt a connection he couldn't explain, as if the ancient creature was looking straight into his soul and finding something worth preserving. Then, the ships opened fire, and Marcus Chen, exiled Marine and defender of the innocent, disappeared in a blaze of energy that lit up the crimson peaks like a second sunrise. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the great dragon spreading its tattered wings and breathing fire with renewed strength, as if his sacrifice had somehow given it the power to continue fighting. The last thing he felt was a strange sense of peace, knowing that he'd finally found a cause worthy of his honor. What Marcus didn't know was that this was only the beginning of his story, not the end. Dragons, as he was about to discover, had very long memories and very particular ideas about justice. And they never forgot a kindness. The first sensation Marcus experienced wasn't sight or sound, it was warmth. Deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to flow through his bones and settle in his chest like liquid sunlight. For someone who should have been dead, vaporized by military-grade energy weapons, it was a surprisingly pleasant way to return to consciousness. The second sensation was the breathing. Not his own breathing, that came later, with a gasp that echoed strangely in whatever space he now occupied. This other breathing was massive, rhythmic, like the slow bellows of some enormous forge. Each inhalation seemed to move mountains of air, while each exhalation carried the faint scent of sulfur and something else Marcus couldn't identify. When his eyes finally opened, Marcus found himself staring at the most beautiful ceiling he'd ever seen. Crystalline formations hung from rocky surfaces dozens of meters above, each one glowing with soft, inner light that painted everything in shades of gold and amber. The cavern, for that's clearly what this was, stretched beyond his vision in all directions, supported by natural pillars that looked like they'd been carved by patient gods. "You wake at last, little warrior." The voice resonated through the chamber with the depth of distant thunder. Marcus tried to sit up and discovered that his body felt wrong, not damaged, exactly, but different in ways he couldn't immediately understand. His hands looked the same, but when he flexed his fingers, tiny sparks of electricity danced between them. He turned toward the source of the voice and found himself face to face with the largest living creature he'd ever encountered. The dragon that had defended the nursery was even more magnificent up close. Its scales weren't just metallic, they seemed to contain entire galaxies, swirling with colors that had no names in any human language. The creature's head alone was larger than most ground cars, but its eyes held intelligence and compassion that made Marcus feel suddenly, profoundly small. "You died well," the dragon continued, its mental voice somehow bypassing Marcus's ears entirely. "Courage without hope of reward. Sacrifice without thought of glory. The ancestors would be proud." "I'm dead?" Marcus managed to ask, though speaking felt strange, as if the words were being formed by muscles that weren't quite his own anymore. The dragon's massive head tilted slightly, an expression that might have been amusement. "You were dead. The mercenary weapons left nothing of your original form but scattered atoms and noble intent. But dragons have long memories, young one, and longer debts." Marcus struggled to his feet, noting that his movements felt more fluid than they ever had during his human life. "What did you do to me? We gave you what your species calls a second chance, though the process is older than your civilization." The dragon's tail swept across the cavern floor, disturbing formations that had taken millennia to grow. "You offered your life to protect our young. The laws of balance demand that such a gift cannot go unanswered." As the dragon spoke, other shapes emerged from the shadows of the vast chamber. More dragons, each one unique in size and coloration, but all bearing the scars of recent combat. Marcus counted at least a dozen, though the cavern's size and the play of light and shadow made it difficult to be certain. "The mercenaries?" Marcus asked. "Destroyed," rumbled another dragon, this one with scales like polished copper. "Your sacrifice disrupted their formation long enough for us to bring them down. But the cost was high. 7 of our kin fell in the battle, including 2 guardians of the deep knowledge." Marcus felt a weight settle in his chest. 7 deaths. All because some corporation had decided dragon-occupied territory was worth more than dragon lives. It was the same story he'd seen played out across the galaxy, the strong preying on the weak, the innocent paying for other people's greed. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I should have acted sooner." The great dragon's eyes seemed to glow brighter. "Spoken like a true guardian. Tell us, Marcustion of the human marines, do you know why we chose to bring you back?" Marcus blinked in surprise. "You know my name?" "We know many things. Your species thinks they understand the nature of communication, but you barely scratch the surface." The dragon's mental voice carried undertones of ancient amusement. "When someone dies in our presence, we experience their final thoughts, their deepest memories. We know of your exile, your disgrace, your determination to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Heat flooded Marcus's face, or what he assumed was his face. The idea that these magnificent beings had witnessed his most private moments of shame and failure was almost unbearable. "Peace, young warrior," the dragon continued. "Shame has no place here. We see not the judgment of small-minded politicians, but the core of who you truly are. That is why we chose to offer you the Crimson Transformation." "The what?" Another dragon, this one bearing scales that shifted between blue and silver, moved closer. "A gift rarely given, never taken lightly. Your consciousness, your memories, your essential self, preserved and reborn in a form capable of bridging our peoples." Marcus looked down at his hands again, really studying them this time. The skin was his, but somehow more resilient, and those electrical sparks weren't his imagination. When he concentrated, he could feel energy flowing through his body like a second circulatory system. "You made me part dragon," he said, "and it wasn't a question." "We made you a guardian," the great dragon corrected. "The transformation grants enhanced strength, the ability to survive in hostile environments, and other gifts that will manifest as you learn to use them. But, more importantly, it grants you purpose." The dragon's massive form shifted, and Marcus realized it was preparing to stand. When it rose to its full height, the creature's head nearly brushed the cavern's ceiling, and its presence filled the chamber like a force of nature. "The attack on our nesting sites was not random," the dragon explained, its mental voice taking on harder edges. "Preliminary strikes, designed to test our defenses and eliminate witnesses. Our deep knowledge suggests that much larger forces are gathering, preparing to claim this world and strip it of everything valuable." Marcus felt his new muscles tense automatically. "Mining corporations?" "Worse. The data we recovered from the destroyed ships indicates involvement by the hegemony." The dragon's name for the enemy carried undertones of disgust and ancient hatred. "They seek not just mineral wealth, but dragon eggs for their biological weapons programs." The hegemony. Marcus had fought them before during his service in the Galactic Defense Corps. They were technically a recognized government, but their methods made pirates look civilized. If the hegemony was involved, this situation was about to become much more complicated and much more dangerous. "How long do we have?" Marcus asked. "Their main fleet will arrive within the next lunar cycle, possibly sooner. When they come, they will not be content with a few bombing runs. They will bring orbital platforms, atmospheric processors, and enough firepower to strip this world down to bedrock." Marcus processed this information with the tactical part of his mind that 20 years of military service had honed to razor sharpness. A single lunar cycle on Drakmor 7 was roughly equivalent to 3 standard weeks. Not much time to prepare for a full-scale invasion, especially when the defending force consisted of injured dragons and one transformed human with abilities he didn't understand yet. "What do you need me to do?" The question came out automatically, driven by instincts that apparently survived even death and resurrection. The great dragon regarded him with what might have been approval. "First, you must learn to use your new capabilities. The transformation grants many gifts, but they require understanding and practice." The dragon gestured with one massive claw toward a section of the cavern Marcus hadn't noticed before. The training chambers contain environments designed to test and develop guardian abilities. "And after that?" "After that, you must decide if you truly wish to stand with us. The coming battle will be unlike anything your species has experienced. The hegemony does not simply conquer, they remake worlds according to their own twisted vision. If we fail, every living thing on Drakmor 7 will either die or be transformed into something unrecognizable." Marcus thought about the settlement he'd left behind, Kowalski and his inn, the young girl who'd warned them about the attack, the miners and traders who were just trying to make honest livings on a hard world. None of them deserved to become victims of hegemony experimentation. "I'm in," he said without hesitation. The great dragon's eyes blazed with satisfaction. "Then, let us see what kind of guardian you will become." The training began immediately. The cavern system, Marcus discovered, was far more extensive than he'd initially realized. Chambers connected to chambers through passages that led deep into the planetary crust, each one adapted for different purposes. Some contained mineral formations that could withstand incredible stress, perfect for testing enhanced strength. Others were filled with toxic gases or extreme temperatures, ideal for learning environmental resistance. Marcus's first lesson was simply learning to control the electrical energy that now flowed through his body. The dragon explained that this was a byproduct of the transformation process. His human nervous system had been enhanced with draconic bioelectric capabilities that would allow him to interface with both organic and technological systems in ways no baseline human could manage. Focus on the energy, the dragon instructor told him, a relatively young specimen whose scales rippled with patterns of green and gold. Feel it move through your body. Learn its rhythm, its preferences. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to sense the electrical flow. At first, it felt like trying to grab smoke, but gradually he began to perceive patterns. The energy moved along his nervous system, but also through pathways that definitely hadn't existed in his original human form. When he concentrated, he could direct it to specific areas: his hands, his eyes, even his vocal cords. Good, the instructor rumbled. Now try to project it. Marcus opened his eyes and stared at a target crystal the dragons had set up across the chamber. He visualized the energy flowing out of his body, forming a bridge between himself and the crystal. Lightning erupted from his fingertips, striking the target and causing it to glow with absorbed power. Impressive for a first attempt, the instructor noted. Most guardians require several cycles to achieve projection. The sessions continued for hours, each one revealing new aspects of his transformed physiology. Marcus discovered that he could survive in vacuum for short periods, that his reflexes were now fast enough to track objects moving at supersonic speeds, and that his enhanced senses could detect electromagnetic signatures from incredible distances. More importantly, he learned that the transformation had given him the ability to interface directly with dragon technology. Your people think of technology as separate from biology, the great dragon explained during one of their theoretical sessions. Dragons never made such distinctions. Our tools grow rather than being manufactured. Our weapons bond with their wielders. Our ships become extensions of their pilots rather than mere vehicles. To demonstrate, the dragon led Marcus to another chamber where several sleek, organic-looking objects rested in crystal alcoves. They resembled a cross between sophisticated weapons and sleeping creatures, all flowing curves and internal structures that pulsed with their own light. Choose one, the dragon instructed. But choose carefully. The bond, once formed, cannot be easily broken. Marcus studied the weapons, trying to understand what made them different from each other. One looked like a rifle butt, with tendrils instead of a traditional stock. Another resembled a sword, but its blade seemed to be made of contained energy rather than solid matter. A third was harder to classify: part shield, part sensor array, part something else entirely. He found himself drawn to a device that looked like a combination of armor and weapon. When he touched it, the thing seemed to wake up, its surface rippling with patterns of blue and silver that matched his own enhanced nervous system. The moment Marcus picked up the device, it flowed over his arm like liquid metal, forming seamless connections with his transformed physiology. Knowledge flooded his mind, not instructions, but understanding. The weapon could project energy shields, fire precisely controlled bolts of plasma, and even generate localized gravitational fields for enhanced mobility. A guardian's blade, the great dragon observed with satisfaction. It has been waiting 3 centuries for a worthy wielder. Marcus flexed his newly armored arm, marveling at how natural it felt. The weapon armor wasn't separate from him, it had become part of him, as integrated as his heartbeat or breathing. How long until I'm ready? He asked. The dragon's mental voice carried undertones of urgency. Time grows short. Our scouts report movement at the edge of the system, advanced ships, probably conducting final reconnaissance before the main fleet arrives. Marcus felt his enhanced senses automatically cataloging potential threats and tactical considerations. The transformation had apparently enhanced his strategic thinking as well as his physical capabilities. Then, we'd better get the settlement evacuated, he said. Those people won't stand a chance if they're caught in the open when the hegemony arrives. The great dragon's eyes blazed with something that might have been pride. Spoken like a true guardian. But evacuation may prove more complicated than you realize. Why? Because, young warrior, the hegemony has allies already on the surface. And they have been watching you. The revelation that enemies were already operating on Drakmor 7 hit Marcus like a physical blow. His enhanced senses immediately began scanning for threats, the Guardian's blade responding to his elevated stress by shifting into a more aggressive configuration around his arm. Hegemony agents, he asked, though he already suspected the answer would be more complicated than simple infiltration. The great dragon's massive head swayed slowly from side to side. Worse than agents. Collaborators. Humans who have chosen to serve the hegemony in exchange for promises of power and protection when the invasion begins. Marcus felt his jaw clench. During his years with the Galactic Defense Corps, he'd encountered collaborators before, people willing to betray their own species for personal gain. They were often more dangerous than alien enemies because they understood human psychology and tactics. How many? Our surveillance suggests at least a dozen, possibly more. They have been gathering intelligence on the settlement's defenses and population, mapping evacuation routes, and identifying potential resistance leaders. The dragon's mental voice carried notes of ancient disgust. They wear the faces of friends while sharpening knives for their neighbors' backs. Marcus began pacing the chamber, his transformed physiology automatically adjusting his balance and movement patterns for maximum efficiency. The Guardian training had enhanced more than just his physical capabilities, his tactical analysis skills had been elevated to an almost supernatural level. They'll have communications equipment, he reasoned aloud. Some way to coordinate with the incoming fleet. If we can identify and neutralize them before the main invasion begins. Precisely what we hoped you would conclude, rumbled another dragon, this one bearing scars that spoke of many battles. But the task will not be simple. These collaborators have had months to establish their positions and earn trust within the settlement community. The great dragon shifted its massive form, crystal formations chiming softly as they were disturbed. There is another complication. Our deep knowledge indicates that the hegemony's primary objective is not simply conquest. They seek something specific to this world, something that requires the dragons to be eliminated entirely. Marcus stopped pacing. What kind of something? The Eternal Forge. The words resonated through the chamber with power that made the crystal formations ring like bells. Other dragons throughout the vast cavern raised their heads, as if the very mention of the name demanded acknowledgement. I've never heard of it, Marcus admitted. The great dragon's eyes blazed brighter. Few have. It is one of the oldest artifacts in this sector of the galaxy, created by the first dragons during an age when the barriers between dimensions were thinner than spider silk. A device capable of reshaping matter and energy at the most fundamental level. The implications hit Marcus immediately. A weapon? A tool, the dragon corrected. Like all powerful tools, it can be used for creation or destruction depending on the wisdom and intent of its wielder. In the right hands, it could terraform dead worlds, cure diseases that have plagued civilizations for millennia, or even restore species that have been driven to extinction. And, in the wrong hands? The dragon's mental voice grew darker. The hegemony could use it to remake entire star systems according to their vision. Biological weapons that adapt and evolve. Planetary defenses that grow stronger with each attack they survive. Soldiers that cannot be killed because death itself has been redefined. Marcus felt his enhanced nervous system processing the tactical implications at superhuman speed. An artifact that powerful would shift the balance of galactic power permanently. If the hegemony gained control of it, no force in known space would be capable of stopping them. Where is this forge located? Deep within the planetary core, protected by safeguards that have stood for millions of years. The dragons of this world are its guardians, just as our ancestors were guardians before us. But the safeguards are failing. The great dragon's massive tail swept across the cavern floor, creating patterns in the accumulated crystal dust. The forge requires biological energy to maintain its protective barriers, specifically, the life force of dragons who willingly bond their essence to the guardianship. Each generation, some of our kin choose to join the Eternal Watch, adding their strength to the defenses. But, you've lost too many, Marcus realized. The mercenary attack, previous conflicts. Yes. We are now below the critical threshold needed to maintain the barriers indefinitely. Within one full planetary rotation, the safeguards will fail entirely, and the forge will become accessible to anyone with sufficient knowledge and determination. Marcus felt pieces of the puzzle clicking together in his enhanced mind. That's why the timing of this invasion is so specific. The hegemony knows about the failing safeguards. They've probably been planning this operation for years, waiting for exactly this moment. The dragon's confirmation came not in words but in a wave of mental approval that Marcus felt like warm sunlight. The collaborators are not just gathering intelligence, Marcus continued, his tactical analysis reaching new conclusions. They're also ensuring that no one on the surface can interfere with the excavation process. When the main fleet arrives, they'll need to dig down to the planetary core and extract the forge before you can restore the guardianship. A process that will require destroying most of the planet's surface, another dragon added grimly. Millions of tons of rock and metal must be moved. The environmental damage will render this world uninhabitable for centuries. Marcus felt rage building in his chest, not the hot, unfocused anger he'd experienced as a human, but something colder and more purposeful. The hegemony wasn't just planning to conquer Drakmor 7, they were planning to destroy it completely while committing genocide against the dragon species. "We need to move fast," he said. "How long before the safeguards fail completely?" 27 local hours, the Great Dragon replied. Perhaps less if the planetary stress from orbital bombardment accelerates the decay process. 27 hours. Marcus had planned military operations under tight deadlines before, but never anything quite this crucial or complex. They needed to identify and neutralize the collaborators, organize the civilian population for evacuation or defense, somehow restore the forge's protective barriers, and prepare for a full-scale invasion by the most ruthless military force in known space. What resources do we have? The dragon gestured toward the deeper sections of the cavern. 15 adult dragons capable of combat operations, though several are still healing from the mercenary attack. Approximately 50 eggs in the deep nurseries, which must be protected at all costs. Various defensive systems built into the mountain complex itself. And dragon technology? Limited. Our manufacturing capabilities were designed for peace, not war. Most of our combat systems are biological rather than mechanical, requiring time and resources we do not possess. Marcus activated his Guardian's blade, studying the way it interfaced with his transformed nervous system. This armor weapon of mine, are there others? 3 additional Guardian devices remain in stasis, but they were designed for dragon physiology. Without another transformed human to wield them. What about the settlement's population? How many people are we talking about? The Great Dragon's mental voice carried notes of uncertainty. Our observations suggest approximately 800 humans in the primary settlement, with perhaps 200 more scattered among the outlying mining camps and research stations. 1,000 people. Marcus had been responsible for civilian evacuations before, but never under circumstances quite this extreme. Moving 1,000 people off-world would require significant transport capacity, and there was no guarantee that refugee ships would be able to arrive before the hegemony fleet. We need intelligence on the collaborators, Marcus decided. Names, positions, capabilities. Can your surveillance provide that level of detail? Some information, yes. But direct observation of human settlements is difficult for beings of our size. Most of our intelligence comes from monitoring electronic communications and observing behavioral patterns from a distance. Marcus nodded, already formulating plans. Then, I'll need to go back to the settlement. Infiltrate the community, identify the traitors, and neutralize them before they can coordinate with the incoming fleet. Dangerous, rumbled the scarred dragon. If the collaborators suspect your transformation, they will not hesitate to eliminate you. They're welcome to try, Marcus replied, and was surprised by the confidence he heard in his own voice. The Guardian training had apparently done more than enhance his capabilities, it had fundamentally changed his approach to threat assessment. There is another concern, the Great Dragon added. Your appearance has been altered by the transformation process. You remain recognizably human, but the changes may be noticeable to careful observers. Marcus looked down at his hands again. The skin tone was subtly different, and there were faint patterns of scarring that definitely hadn't existed before his death. His eyes, he realized, probably showed the same metallic flecks that characterized dragon vision. I'll manage, he said. What about communication? If I'm operating in the settlement, I'll need some way to coordinate with you. The dragon indicated a section of his Guardian's blade that Marcus hadn't noticed before. The weapon contains bioquantum entanglement systems that will allow limited telepathic communication across significant distances. The connection will be weak, but sufficient for basic coordination. Marcus studied the device, marveling again at the seamless integration of biological and technological systems. Human science was centuries away from developing anything this sophisticated. How soon can I leave? Immediately, if you feel ready. But, remember, once you enter the settlement, you will be operating without backup. If the collaborators discover your true nature or purpose, we will not be able to assist you directly. Marcus thought about Kowalski and the Rusty Comet, about the young girl who'd warned them about the dragon attack, about the 1,000 innocent people who had no idea that their world was about to become a battlefield. He thought about the Eternal Forge and what would happen if the hegemony gained control of it. "I'm ready," he said. The great dragon's massive head lowered until its eyes were level with Marcus's. "Then, go, Guardian. Hunt the traitors who hide among the innocent. Protect those who cannot protect themselves. Show the galaxy what happens when dragons choose to honor a human sacrifice." Marcus felt power flow through the Guardian's blade as the weapon reconfigured itself into a more subtle form, still present, still bonded to his transformed physiology, but appearing to casual observation as nothing more than an unusual piece of body armor. As he prepared to leave the crystal caverns and return to a world that no longer knew him, Marcus Chen reflected on how completely his life had changed. 3 days ago, he'd been a disgraced exile with nothing left to lose. Now he was something unprecedented, a human guardian bonded to dragon technology, carrying the responsibility for preventing an artifact of unimaginable power from falling into the worst possible hands. The journey back to the settlement took less time than his original trip to the Crimson Peaks, partly because his enhanced physiology allowed him to maintain superhuman speed and endurance, and partly because he now knew exactly where he was going and why. As the lights of the settlement came into view across the barren landscape, Marcus began activating sensory enhancements he was still learning to control. His vision automatically adjusted for optimal target discrimination, his hearing filtered background noise to focus on potential threats, and his tactical analysis systems began cataloging defensive positions and evacuation routes. Somewhere in that collection of domes and converted shipping containers, traitors were preparing to betray their own species. Marcus flexed his transformed hands and felt electricity dance between his fingers. They were about to discover that some betrayals carried a higher price than others. Marcus entered the settlement just as the twin moons reached their zenith, casting long shadows between the interconnected buildings. His enhanced senses immediately began cataloging details that his human perception would have missed: electromagnetic signatures from concealed communication equipment, subtle chemical traces that suggested off-world technology, and the micro-expressions of people who were trying very hard to appear normal. The Rusty Comet looked exactly the same as when he'd left it, but Marcus now perceived layers of information that had been invisible to him before. His Guardian-enhanced vision could detect heat signatures through the building's walls, while his electrical sensitivity picked up the distinctive patterns of surveillance equipment. Someone had been watching his room. Marcus circled the building once, using his new sensory capabilities to map the locations of every electronic device in the vicinity. Most were standard settlement infrastructure, environmental controls, communication relays, basic security systems. But 3 signatures stood out as anomalous, too sophisticated and too carefully hidden for a frontier mining town. He entered through the inn's rear service entrance, moving with the fluid precision that his transformed physiology made effortless. The corridors were empty at this hour, but Marcus could hear voices from the common room, late-night drinkers and insomniacs who formed the backbone of any frontier community's social network. His room had definitely been searched. To most people, the signs would have been invisible, a few items moved by millimeters, dust patterns disturbed in barely detectable ways. But Marcus's enhanced senses painted a complete picture of the intrusion. Professional work, but not perfect. The searchers had been looking for specific items and had been disappointed when they didn't find them. Marcus activated the communication system in his Guardian's blade, establishing a weak telepathic link with the Dragon Caverns. The sensation was strange, like having a conversation with someone standing just outside his range of hearing. "Contact established," came the great dragon's mental voice. "Report your status, in position. Surveillance confirmed. Beginning active intelligence gathering, exercise extreme caution. Our deep scanners detect multiple ships approaching the outer system. Time grows short." Marcus acknowledged the warning and closed the link to avoid detection. If the collaborators had sophisticated monitoring equipment, prolonged telepathic communication might register on their sensors. He needed information, and he needed it fast. The common room of the Rusty Comet buzzed with the usual collection of late-night conversations. Miners discussing shift schedules, traders comparing prices, a few off-duty prospectors celebrating a successful find with too much synthetic alcohol. To casual observation, it was exactly what anyone would expect from a frontier settlement. But Marcus now saw the subtle patterns that revealed something more sinister. Three men sat at separate tables, nursing drinks and, apparently paying no attention to each other. But, their positioning formed a perfect surveillance triangle that covered every entrance to the room. Their clothing was slightly too clean for actual miners, and their hands showed none of the calluses and scars that came from working with heavy equipment in hostile environments. More damning, Marcus's electrical sensitivity detected the distinctive signature of encrypted communication implants. Military-grade hardware that definitely didn't belong in a civilian settlement. He ordered a drink from Kowalski and settled into a corner table, activating his Guardian sensory systems to their maximum sensitivity. Over the next hour, he built a comprehensive profile of the surveillance team's operation. The three men were using microburst transmissions to coordinate their activities, sending coded updates to a central controller somewhere else in the settlement. Their positioning and timing suggested professional military training, probably Special Forces veterans who'd been recruited by hegemony intelligence services. But they weren't the only ones. Marcus identified at least 6 additional individuals throughout the common room who showed similar anomalies. Too clean, too alert, carrying concealed weapons that weren't typical of frontier colonists. The collaboration network was larger and more sophisticated than the Dragons had estimated. As the evening progressed, Marcus began to piece together fragments of the conspiracy. The collaborators weren't just gathering intelligence, they were positioning themselves to take control of key infrastructure when the invasion began. Power systems, communication networks, transportation hubs, even the settlement's limited defensive capabilities. When the hegemony fleet arrived, they would find the colony's resistance already neutralized from within. Around midnight, one of the surveillance operatives received a priority transmission that caused him to stand up immediately and head for the exit. Marcus waited exactly 30 seconds, then followed. The night air was bitter cold, but Marcus's transformed physiology automatically adjusted to maintain optimal operating temperature. He tracked his target through the settlement's maze of corridors and connecting tunnels, using his enhanced stealth capabilities to remain undetected. The operative led him to a converted shipping container on the settlement's eastern edge, a building that appeared on the official maps as a secondary supply depot but which Marcus's enhanced vision revealed to be something much more sophisticated. The structure was shielded against electronic surveillance and powered by a fusion cell that was far too advanced for civilian use. This was the collaborators' command center, and it was preparing for major activity. Marcus positioned himself among the thermal exchangers outside the building and activated his Guardian's blade in passive reconnaissance mode. The weapon's bioquantum sensors could penetrate most shielding systems without triggering detection alerts. What he discovered made his enhanced nervous system surge with combat-ready electricity. Inside the command center, 12 people were gathered around sophisticated holographic displays showing orbital approach vectors and planetary surface maps. The displays included detailed intelligence on dragon nesting sites, structural weaknesses in the mountain caves, and proposed excavation routes to the planetary core. They weren't just planning to assist with an invasion, they were providing targeting data for a genocide. Marcus activated his communication link with the dragons, transmitting everything he'd observed. The response came back immediately, heavy with urgency and growing desperation. The advanced ships have entered the outer system. Main fleet arrival estimated in 6 local hours. The forge safeguards are deteriorating faster than predicted, *6 hours. Marcus felt his tactical analysis systems shift into emergency mode, processing dozens of potential scenarios at superhuman speed. He could eliminate the command center and its occupants, but that would alert the remaining collaborators and potentially trigger premature activation of the invasion timeline. Alternatively, he could attempt to infiltrate the center and gather additional intelligence, but the risk of detection was high and the potential gains uncertain. Then, his enhanced hearing detected something that changed everything. Final confirmation from Orbital Command, one of the collaborators was saying. The Dragon Guardian sites will be hit with kinetic bombardment in 4 hours. Surface teams are to begin excavation operations immediately afterward. 4 hours, not 6. And kinetic bombardment meant the hegemony intended to drop asteroid-sized projectiles directly onto the Dragon caverns. Even if the ancient beings survived the initial impact, they would be trapped under millions of tons of rubble while excavation teams systematically extracted the Eternal Forge. Marcus made his decision. He withdrew from the command center and activated his communication link to full power, regardless of detection risk. Priority override. Enemy timeline accelerated. Kinetic bombardment in 4 hours. Beginning immediate neutralization of hostile assets. The Great Dragon's response carried notes of grim satisfaction. Acknowledged. All dragons moving to emergency defensive positions. Guardian protocols now active. Show them why legends are born. Marcus felt something change in his transformed physiology as the words registered. The Guardian's blade began reconfiguring itself, revealing capabilities that had remained dormant during his training. His enhanced senses expanded to encompass electromagnetic spectrums he hadn't known existed. His tactical analysis systems integrated with some deeper, more ancient intelligence that spoke in whispers of duty and honor. He was no longer just Marcus Chen, disgraced Marine. He was a guardian of the Eternal Forge, bonded to powers that had protected the galaxy for millions of years. And he had work to do. The elimination of the command center took less than 3 minutes. Marcus's enhanced stealth capabilities allowed him to enter the shielded building undetected, while his electrical control systems let him disable their communications before anyone could trigger an alert. The collaborators inside were experienced soldiers, but none of them were prepared to face an opponent who could move faster than humanly possible and project lightning from his fingertips. When it was over, Marcus stood among the wreckage of their sophisticated equipment and felt a grim satisfaction. The remaining collaborators would realize something had gone wrong when their command center failed to check in, but, without their central coordination, they would be reduced to isolated cells operating on outdated intelligence. He spent the next hour hunting down the other operatives, using information gathered from the command center to locate their safe houses and backup positions. Each elimination was quick and efficient, leaving no evidence that could be traced back to him or the dragons. By the time the first kinetic projectiles began falling from orbit, Marcus had neutralized 17 collaborators and disabled their primary communication network. The settlement's population was confused but alive, unaware that they'd been marked for systematic extermination by people they'd trusted. The bombardment of the Crimson Peaks began just as the twin moons started to set. Standing on the settlement's observation deck, Marcus watched massive fireballs streak across the sky and impact the distant mountains with force that shook the entire continental plate. But he also saw something the hegemony hadn't anticipated. The mountains fought back. Ancient defensive systems that had slumbered for millennia awakened as the Dragon Guardians activated emergency protocols. Energy barriers flickered into existence around the peaks, absorbing and redirecting the kinetic impacts. Counter-battery systems emerged from concealed positions, sending streams of coherent energy toward the orbital platforms. And, from the deepest caverns, something vast and golden began to rise. Marcus felt the Eternal Forge awakening through his connection to the Guardian systems, its power flowing through quantum channels that connected every dragon-bonded device on the planet. The ancient artifact wasn't just a tool, it was a living system that had been waiting for this moment, when the balance between creation and destruction would be decided. The battle for Drakmor 7 had begun, but the hegemony was about to discover that some treasures defended themselves. As the first hegemony assault shuttles began descending through the atmosphere, Marcus activated his Guardian's blade to full combat configuration and felt ancient power flow through his transformed body. The dragons had chosen well when they honored a human sacrifice with resurrection and purpose. Now it was time to show the galaxy what happened when legends fought back. The Eternal Forge pulsed with golden light that could be seen from orbit, and, across the settlement, normal humans began to realize they were witnessing something extraordinary. This was the moment when Marcus Chen, exiled warrior, became something more than human. This was the moment he became a legend. The hegemony had come to steal a god's weapon and commit genocide for profit. Instead, they found themselves facing an enemy they couldn't understand, couldn't predict, and couldn't defeat. Dragons, after all, had very long memories. And they never forgot a kindness.